Quote, "Mr. Chairman, I have been in the Mafia most of my adult life. I have been aware of it ever since I was a child in Cleveland. It has changed since I first joined in the 1940s, and especially in the last few years with the growth of narcotics. Greed is causing younger members to go into narcotics without the knowledge of the families. These younger members lack the discipline and respect that made this thing as strong as it once was."
The legends of America's mobs are woven into the fabric of society and pop culture. We've all seen the movies or heard the tales of these criminal organizations. Their stories of power, wealth, respect, family, greed, betrayal, violence, murder, and mayhem. While the golden age of the mobs may be over, organized crime continues to thrive, and the stories remain as infamous as ever. You're listening to the Gangland History Podcast, hosted by mob historian Jacob Stoops. He tells the true crime biographies of real-life mobsters and dives deep into the plots, subplots, and real facts behind organized crime in America. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Gangland History Podcast. I'm your host, mob historian and podcaster, Jacob Stoops. Today, we've got a great show in which we continue the State of the Mafia 1967 series. If you haven't already, I highly encourage you to go back and watch the State of the Mafia Part 1. The rules that hold us together is it will be a very good primer for this episode's content. But before we get into the episode, I just want to take a moment to thank my loyal Patreon subscribers and capos who've gone above and beyond to support this channel, including Craig, David, George, Mr. Kuznarski, Puppet Master, Brady, and many of you who've signed up as free members as well. Thank you. Really, really appreciate it. Just remember, if you sign up as a capo, your money goes to supporting the show, which helps me continue to put out great content, and in return, you'll get shout-outs, Patreon-exclusive content, and more. In any event, let's go ahead and get into the show, which I'm calling The State of the Mafia 1967 Part 2, Life or Death Obligations. Like the first part of this series, this report will jump around a lot, but in the end, I think you'll still enjoy it, and hopefully it teaches you a couple of three things.
Take out an entire fucking family?
Let me tell you a couple of three things.
Okay, so let's reset the stage here. This 1967 FBI report, which we began to cover in Part 1, again, go watch or listen to it first if you haven't, is a veritable goldmine of information. The aim at the time of creation of the report was focused on providing an overall picture of LCN membership and activities throughout the United States as things stood in 1967. The report was declassified in 1996. The originator of the report was a man named Robert G. O'Neill, again, not to be confused with former Navy SEAL Robert J. O'Neill, who has claimed to have fired the shot that killed Osama bin Laden. And the report itself was submitted to the FBI director at the time, one J. Edgar Hoover. As I said in the Part 1 episode, while I did a Basics of the Mob series very early on in this podcast's history, this report is simply something that I came across and found the information contained within so interesting that I decided it was worth multiple episodes. Sometimes in the course of historical research, you just find things that are simply too good not to share. In this case, I found this report by accident, got to reading it, and was very much enthralled by it. I think I said that the first time. And based on the responses in the first episode, a 96% approval rating on YouTube, I do think it's worth continuing. In Part 1, I covered the following topics: the historical background of the Mafia and where it came from, the Commission, its members and purpose, organizational structure, terminology, qualifications, and admission to membership, initiation rites, and the differences between regions and families in making ceremonies. In this episode, we're going to continue along that track, but we're going to cover membership obligations, advantages of La Cosa Nostra membership, security measures, and transfer of members. For the sake of time, we'll stop this episode after transfers of members. The report in its entirety will likely require 4 parts in total to fully cover and will be linked in the description of the episode. Again, it contains references to 50 plus cities and 196 informants in total, so it's a massive dossier and treasure trove of information on the Mafia. I highly recommend you click that link and just go ahead and go read it for yourself. It's really good stuff. All right, that's enough setup. Let's go ahead and dig back in. For today's episode, the first topic we'll get into surrounds membership obligations. Once you're a member, or even before, just what are your obligations to your Mafia family? The report does its best to lay some examples out. For example, do you have to kill somebody to be admitted as a made member of the Mafia? An informant dubbed NYT-161 laid out the answer to his FBI handlers on August 7th, 1967. Quote, membership obligations. On August 7th, 1966, NYT-161, when queried as to whether or not it was necessary for a potential member of redacted family to murder someone before being admitted, advised that this was not true at this time. Informant stated that after a person is admitted to membership, if he were ordered to kill someone, he would be obliged to do this or be killed himself. In this connection, informant stated that when a sanction hit is ordered, usually 2 individuals are given the specific contract, and 3 or 4 additional individuals are advised of the proposed murder and are situated in the vicinity of the murder to act as backup men in the event the hitmen are pursued or if they themselves, for some reason, are unable to complete the job. Informant stated that he had been told that Redacted had murdered someone for another group in the Redacted family, but was unable to furnish any more specific details in this regard. End quote. For casual listeners to the mob genre, this report may come as a surprise. However, for hardcore listeners familiar with the history, it's probably no surprise. In the mob, there are guys who do work and there are guys who are earners. In the old days, there are indications that this was absolutely a requirement in most Mafia families, sealing the bonds between members in blood. And in the 1920s and 1930s, there was murder and mayhem on the streets of nearly every major city in the country. Combine that with less law enforcement ability to identify killers and send them to prison, it makes a lot more sense that this rule would have been more enforceable then, but less enforceable as time has gone by, especially now. According to former made guys like Michael Francis and Michael DiLeonardo, while it's possible to be both a big earner and a hitman, it's rare. Most guys are one or the other, hitter or moneymaker. And this makes sense. There are certainly many stories of guys committing murders prior to their entry into the Mafia as a test, but there are also guys like Robert DiBernardo, aka DB, or Tommy Gambino, who likely never pulled a trigger on anyone, but who were huge earners for the crime family. In most families, if you believe the stories, there are really just a handful of guys earning big-time money, while the rest struggle in most cases to meet ends meet. So the real earners should be protected and kept away from the murders in order to keep the cash coming in. On top of all that, I think DiLeonardo put it best when he said something to the effect of, if everyone had to kill to get in, there'd be no Mafia left. And I think I tend to agree. Regarding the piece about notifying and bringing more than one person along on hits, again, this is probably a surprise, but it makes sense. While increasing the number of people aware of a hit contract creates risk, if you've studied the history or listened to former mobsters talk, it's usually true that there is an entire hit team, each with distinct roles and responsibilities. Though it's certainly happened, it's rare that a hit is conducted by a lone gunman. You usually have a setup guy to arrange the work and lead the team, guys in crash cars to help the guys doing the work evade police, along with one or a handful of shooters. In cases where a hit is done privately, you sometimes also have a cleanup and disposal crew. The risk of all of this is that if one member of the hit team flips, they can give up the entire operation. But as boss, the goal is to create enough layers of insulation that the guys on the ground can't confirm where the true order is coming from, though they probably all have a good idea. Okay, in the next note, we're going to cover a range of topics. The first has to do with drugs. Quote, membership obligations. On February 15th, 1967, NYT 154 advised as follows. In regard to rules of the family, the informant advised that if a family member is discovered to be addicted to narcotics, he will be killed as he is a danger to the family. End quote. This makes sense. Anyone struggling with an addiction can be unpredictable, which in this world makes them a liability that must be eliminated. One such case was the case of Nicholas Nicky Cowboy Mormondo, who was a member of Sammy Gravano's crew, who was allegedly killed in part due to his addiction to cocaine. Nicky was killed in January of 1986. However, an instance on the flip side of that narrative and within the same crime family was the case of Anthony Tony Roach Rampino. Tony Roach is probably best known as a close associate of John Gotti, member of the Bergen crew, a drug trafficker, hijacker, and backup shooter in the Castellano hit. However, he was also known to be a personal user of drugs, at least for a time. However, rather than being killed and perhaps before it could happen, he was arrested in 1987 for selling $30,000 worth of heroin to an undercover police officer in Ozone Park, Queens, and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He died in a prison hospital in December of 2010, so the Mafia never exacted its edict on him in particular. The last instance that shows this rule is being used as a rule of convenience only was the case of Gerlando, George from Canada, Shasha, of the Bonanno crime family. While I won't get into the entire situation, it's a twisted web of lies and deceit. George from Canada was a very, very popular member of the Bonanno family who served as the primary liaison between the Bonannos, run at the time by Joe Massino, and Canada, specifically the Rizzuto crime family and Vito Rizzuto. Unfortunately for Shasha, he made the fatal mistake of complaining to his boss, Joe Massino, regarding the alleged drug habit of a favorite Massino capo, Anthony T.G. Graziano. This request infuriated Massino, who rather than killing Graziano, put a contract on George from Canada instead. Gerlando Shasha would be found shot dead in the Bronx on March 18, 1999. So, as you can see, sometimes the rules are more like guidelines. Back to the report. Quote, no family member can ever become any kind of law enforcement officer, judge, or serve on a grand jury or petit jury. He must find some way to get himself excused from jury service. End quote. While I can't speak to the jury duty aspect of this note, I do think there is credence to this particular note, though with everything there are exceptions to the rule. I think it may have been John Jr. Gotti who once mentioned as a child to his father that he'd like to dress up as a policeman for Halloween, to which his dad emphatically shut it down. I do believe that this attitude has been generally shared by most mob members over the years. However, on the flip side of this point of view, there are at least two cases I can think of where former members of law enforcement were made into Cosa Nostra families, both of whom turned into informants. These were, of course, Salvatore good-looking Sal Vitale, who was briefly a corrections officer in the state of New York. He went on to be underboss of the Bonanno crime family before flipping in 2003 and making a really big dent in the Bonanno family at the time. The other was Philadelphia's Ron Previty, who was at one time a albeit corrupt Philadelphia police officer before becoming a made man in the Bruno Scarfo family, being inducted specifically in the 1990s by then boss John Stampa. Previty would wear a wire for the FBI for roughly 10 years, in which he'd be paid somewhere between $750,000 and $1 million by the government for his information, despite admittedly still committing crimes. Previty would die of a heart attack, but a free man in 2017. Moving on, the report, citing information from NYT 154, goes into obligations of sit-downs and the life and death consequences of breaking the rules. Quote, he advised that the family at times holds trials. The capo is expected to rise to the defense of one of his members. The family member accused has the right to pick his defender from someone in the family. During the trial of the member, no one is allowed to leave the room. All the facts are usually known before the meeting is held. The accused can confer with his defender regarding his defense out of earshot in a corner of the room. When the trial begins, it is held around the table with the boss presiding. All members must vote orally and openly, starting with the consigliere. The boss votes lastly. The informant stated that the real issue at such a trial usually is whether the accused acted with malice or if he acted out of emotional strain and not intentionality. The informant pointed out that if the trial is concerning a serious violation of family rules committed with malice and forethought, and the penalty was death, the accused would not be there usually, but would be in hiding or trying to get friends of his to change the verdict of death. He stressed the fact that for a serious violation committed intentionally and with malice, the penalty is always death. If the member can hide out and get friends to try to influence the other family members, he will do so. End quote. As guys like Francis, Gravano, Sicali, Di Leonardo have all said that there are times when sit-downs get incredibly intense, even life and death. And of course, judging by the amount of mob murders across the country from the 1930s to the 1990s, these types of scenarios happened often. Regular occurrence, standard operating procedure. The goal, of course, is to avoid these types of scenarios, but as Francis has said, this life is like a wheel, and eventually each person probably has to stand up to the life or death scrutiny at some point. Moving on, the report lays out some of the procedures taken following the death of an LCN member and the importance of the consigliere position. Quote, on July 5th, 1967, NYT7 was queried as to the procedure taken following the death of a member of LCN. Informant stated that it was the responsibility of the Capodicina to see that all members of the family were notified and through his consigliere to see that other interested families would be notified. Informant stated that the most important position in any family was that of consigliere. Informant qualified this by saying that although he was under the boss, he was actually the representative of the family in all business dealings with other families. He compared the position of consigliere with that of a bargaining agent in private business and as a conciliator in labor matters. He stated that the consiglieres were in frequent contact with the respective counterparts of the other families, and prior to any meeting, policy decision, or any matter of importance, they would confer, and as a matter of practicality, the decisions later to be agreed upon by the bosses would have been reached by the consiglieres among themselves. End quote. First, this excerpt regarding the deaths of family members and communication protocol made me think of Johnny Ola's famous line in Godfather 2. In any event, the protocol makes sense.
One by one, our old friends are gone. Death, natural or not. Prison, deported. Hyman Roth is the only one left because he always made money for his partners.
Now, as to the importance of the consigliere, while it is indeed a typically powerful position, the informant made it seem like, at least in my opinion, that it may actually be more important than that of the boss. While I don't know that I agree, there have been some very powerful consiglieres over the course of time within the families, though in some families the role has sometimes been more ceremonial than actually a wielder of power. Some examples of really truly powerful consiglieres over time include John Tardamella, who spent 30 years as the consigliere to Joe Bonanno, very powerful guy. Frank Scalish, who was the consigliere in the now Gambino family before he was murdered in 1957. Michele Big Mike Miranda, who I've done an episode on, and Louis Bobby Manna, who was called the skinny guy, both of the Genovese family, and both were incredibly shrewd, cunning, dangerous, and powerful consiglieres just in different eras of the Genovese family, with Miranda serving as consigliere from the late 50s into the early 70s, and Bobby Manna in the 80s with Chin Gigante and into the 90s before he went to prison. Okay, next up in the report, membership dues, of all things. Quote, membership obligations. New York T77 has previously stated that the redacted Brigade in the past has imposed a head tax on each member. This head tax has been $10 a month per member redacted and slightly higher for capos. This money goes into a kitty maintained by the boss and is supposed to be used for legal expenses of members needing same and for expenses of families imprisoned or needy members. As source has previously advised, the boss is accountable to no one for the kitty and uses it for any purpose he so desires. According to NYT77, this head tax is not presently being assessed among redacted members. NYT77 and NYT75 have advised that various sources of funds are utilized by the Brigade. Any funds derived from activities engaged in by the Brigade are allocated and assigned by the boss. End quote. Another informant would share similar sentiments regarding membership dues and taxes. On August 17, 1966, NYT 161 advised that soldiers in the redacted family pay regular dues to their capo regimes, redacted, and in addition, they are occasionally taxed for a larger amount in the event the necessity arrives within a certain regime whereby a large sum of money is necessary. Informant advised this taxing is usually an assessment based on the success of the individual members and usually varies depending upon how well he is doing. Informant stated that no pressure is exerted against members in the event they are in arrears and paying their dues, especially if it is apparent that they are not making any money or if they were recently discharged from prison. End quote. This area of the report makes sense, and I've heard that made members of families across the country sometimes had to pay membership dues. In this case, it's called a head tax, in order to build the family's war chest to pay for legal expenses, money for families of members who are incarcerated, and etc. This sounds good in practice, and sometimes the families were said to have used this money appropriately. However, what happens when the boss misuses funds or uses them to enrich himself personally? I'm reminded, of course, of many different cases, but specifically for this episode, Joe Profaci, who allegedly instituted a tax on members in addition to demanding a very large percentage of their rackets. As we know, this led to much unrest within the family and ultimately spilled into open war with the Gallo brothers in the early 1960s, and we know that that went on into the 70s as well. Not only that, but it's widely said today that families of members in jail often are not taken care of, which has become, in many cases, one of the key reasons for members and associates to flip and start informing on the family. So it sounds good in practice so long as you have a boss that is using the funds appropriately and members believe that that is the case. All right, let's talk about discipline. This is where the report gets a little dicey, as you're about to see. Quote, membership obligations, discipline. On July 18, 1967, New York T25 advised that if a member had committed sodomy, LCN would take some action depending on what the sodomy consisted of. He stated that if the sodomy was with a woman, probably no action would be taken. However, if the sodomy was committed with a male, he feels the LCN member would be killed. This appears to be the situation regarding Pasquale Massey, Capodicina in the Philadelphia family, who was arrested in the Hot Springs, Arkansas National Park on charges of crime on a government reservation, sodomy, and bribery, which involved a teenage Negro male. According to NYT 86, Massey will probably ultimately have a choice of either committing suicide or being murdered. End quote. Yikes. Okay, so this quote, and I wasn't expecting it as I was reading the report, but this quote speaks to a few things. First, I think it's well known that there is an unspoken rule, and maybe even a spoken rule, against homosexuality in the mob. Does this mean there are no gay members? Of course not, but it does mean that it's not accepted, generally speaking, to have it out in the open. The best example of this policy was probably the murder of John Johnny Boy D'Amato, acting boss of the DeCavalcante crime family in the early 90s. In January of 1992, D'Amato was murdered by members of the DeCavalcante crime family, allegedly for being gay and or bisexual and participating in swingers parties. In 2003, former DeCavalcante mobster Anthony Capo, who was in on the plot, gave the following testimony. Quote, "Nobody's going to respect us if we have a gay homosexual boss sitting down discussing La Cosa Nostra business." End quote. This is very reminiscent and likely the main source of inspiration for the Vito Spatafore storyline in The Sopranos, in which he too is killed for being gay. Now, the note regarding Philadelphia member Pasquale Pat Massey was also very real, based on a 1967 newspaper article that I found. Yet somehow, despite the flagrant violation, Pasquale Pat Massey was somehow let off the hook, was busted down in rank, and allowed to live on for many years. Massey was allegedly replaced as captain by Joseph Lanciano of Camden, New Jersey. This could not have been a good look for Angelo Bruno at the time, though he would reign for 13 more years before being himself assassinated. Let's move on to the section around the advantages of LCN membership, which shares perspectives on the changing attitudes of mobsters in the street as the Mafia developed through the decades. This is a longer excerpt from the report. Quote, Advantages of LCN membership. On September 13th and 15th, 1967, NYT 180 furnished the following information. Informant advised that years ago in the neighborhoods of New York, most of the Italian guys were aspiring to be button guys. He said a button guy received a lot of respect in the neighborhood and was able to use this position to obtain money without getting himself involved in a lot of problems. He said a button guy would work to keep this reputation so that LCN could be strong. Informant pointed out that within the last few years, the button guys have become more of the take what they can and give nothing in return type guy. He said by this, he means these guys all want to bounce around town driving flashy cars and do nothing to keep LCN strong. He pointed out that he understands that a lot of button guys who are not considered stand-up guys are set up by members of the organization for an arrest and then are sent to jail so that they are out of the way. He also explained that when a button guy is in jail, he carries a lot of people and is besieged by other inmates to help them, but usually the button guy cannot get much help himself. He said the family will help the button guy's wife and children while he is in jail, but there have been many times when they have not given any help to the wife or the family. Informant advised that even though it is a practice of LCN members to stay away from narcotics, he feels certain that if money is to be made, a button guy will get involved in narcotics. He explained this by saying that a button guy will be so far removed from the operation that no one could ever say he was involved in it. Informant further advised that button guys have meetings in various places in the city and are usually driven to these meetings by a fringe guy who will never be able to sit in on a meeting. Informant further advised that LCN is so well organized that a button guy or a fringe guy can travel anywhere in the country, and by just giving the name of his boss, he can get whatever he wants. He said the reason for this is that members can make phone calls to wherever a guy is from and sort of get a clearance. He pointed out that if a guy is from New York and he is in California, it might take about 3 or 4 days for this clearance, but if he is nearby, it will only take a few hours. New York T122 commented on the LCN method of communication. He stated that according to family rules, the member is never to engage in name dropping. By this, he means that if he traveled into another family's area, he would not start dropping names of persons he knew to show that he was a member. He stated that whenever anyone starts dropping names of persons they knew in the outfit, it is a sure sign they are not members and are cut off. He advised that when a family member travels into another area and intends to contact another family member, a telephone call will be made from one family to another advising when the traveler will arrive in the new area, where he will be, and whom he will contact. If the traveling member does not adhere to the preset plans, the family members he seeks to contact will have nothing to do with him. End quote. Okay, that's a lot to unpack. However, I think it's a pretty fair statement to suggest that most generations, even today's generation, thinks that things were better off in their time, and that the younger generations just don't understand or aren't as worthy. Within the American Mafia, I do agree that over the years there was a degradation of what it meant to be in the life. Now, I won't go as far as to say that Mafia members were better people back in the old days. In fact, there's 100% more murder and mayhem in those days, so I think you could probably argue somewhat to the latter. However, as time went on, the newer members got further and further away from the old world traditions, the clannish bonds, and moved more towards the quick buck or the flashy lifestyle, and that has continued on to today. When you think about it, this attitude is not uncommon even today when you consider that modern day younger generations all want to be YouTube or TikTok stars. That being said, the guys who came to this country and were a part of the formation of Cosa Nostra didn't do it out of sheer greed in most cases. Many did it because they had to go into the streets just to survive. A lot of poverty involved. It was in many cases not a choice, it was a necessity. And then when Prohibition came along and gave these poor Italian immigrants a chance to rise up out of nothing and make something of themselves, you can't fault them for taking the opportunity. As you become more removed from first-generation immigrants, the choice of becoming a mobster, while sometimes still coming about out of necessity, began becoming more about the money, wealth, and power and prestige that life could bring, and not just about surviving. Carlo Gambino foresaw these changing attitudes and values when he famously closed the books in 1957 and stopped making new members. Paul Castellano would allegedly share a similar sentiment if the quote that is often attributed to him can be believed. Quote, "This life of ours, this is a wonderful life. If you can get through life like this and get away with it, hey, that's great. But it's very, very unpredictable. There's so many ways you can screw it up," end quote. And of course, there is irony in that it was him saying it, given that he was on the wrong end of probably the most infamous Mafia hit ever. Angelo Leonardo, the infamous underboss of the Cleveland crime family, would also lament the changing attitudes and values of new recruits. He would say the following in his court testimony after famously turning informant. Quote, "Mr. Chairman, I have been in the Mafia most of my adult life. I have been aware of it ever since I was a child in Cleveland. It has changed since I first joined in the 1940s, and especially in the last few years with the growth of narcotics. Greed is causing younger members to go into narcotics without the knowledge of the families. These younger members lack the discipline and respect that made this thing as strong as it once was." End quote. Moving along, let's cover a note in the report related to security measures. Quote, F. Security measures. Various sources have advised that strict security measures are in effect subsequent to the Appalachian New York meeting. These sources have advised that members of the Los Angeles LCN family have been instructed to stay away from rosaries, funerals, and weddings, and not to send flowers or cards to associates and members of the family. NYT 75 advised on August 6, 1967, that Los Angeles LCN members were under instructions not to attend the rosary or funeral for former boss Frank DeSimone, who died on August 4, 1967. The above sources have also advised that various orders and instructions are relayed through individual members for security reasons. Members of the organization have been instructed to be surveillance conscious. Meetings between 2 or 3 are generally arranged to occur at racetracks, restaurants, and similar places. Drops are used. Important telephone calls are to be made from public telephone booths in conformance with prearranged plans. Names, dates, and specifics are avoided in these calls, and a type of spoken code, generally in Italian, is used. End quote. I find these notes particularly interesting as I'm sure the precautions after Appalachian were ratcheted up, but to a certain degree, while the heat was being dialed up by the government in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there is still evidence that the Mafia hadn't gone as underground as was probably necessary and still felt somewhat comfortable in certain places. One example was the La Stella restaurant bust in 1966, which netted New York's top mobsters as well as guys from Louisiana and Florida as well, some of the top bosses in the country. Another example of mobsters feeling maybe a bit too comfortable even in the years immediately following Appalachian were the unlawful recorded wiretap conversations of bosses including Ray Patriarca Sr., Angelo Bruno, as well as Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante. After the Kennedy assassination happens in November of 1963, it's clear that the pressure from law enforcement relaxed a little bit in general until you got into the 1980s and RICO began being used more widely. However, for the time, I think the use of drops, public telephone booths, and not sending members to large public gatherings was wise and perhaps should have been taken even farther in hindsight. As time has gone on, and the ability for law enforcement to surveil and convict, as well as the media's relative awareness of the mob has become more prevalent, the mob has pretty much gone bunker-style levels of underground. And perhaps that approach, the modern-day approach, it's rare that we say the modern-day approach is probably what was needed back then, but in this case, the Mafia right now has gone bunker style for many, many years. It's not to say that they don't still get caught and convicted, but they've gone bunker style. And perhaps that level of security was needed even in the 1960s. The last things we'll touch on today centers on the transfer of members from one family to another. Quote, G. Transfer of members. In June 1966, information was received that Frank J. Valenti of Rochester, New York, indicated that if some matter was not resolved during a talk with Steve Magadino, Valenti would go with Joe Bonanno of New York City. End quote. Okay. First off, I'll just say that I was expecting more, and I was a little disappointed in this note, given how comprehensive and multi-perspective the rest of the report was. To only have one note on the procedures or situations involving a transfer of membership from one family to another was disappointing. We'll get to that in just a second. Now, regarding Frank Valenti, who was he and why was he important? Well, Frank Valenti was the head of what is known as the Valenti crime family of Rochester, New York from roughly 1964 to around 1972. Valenti and his brother were both attendees at the infamous 1957 Appalachian meeting, indicating that they'd been made and were important enough to warrant such an invitation. There were no outsiders allowed. There are some reports indicating that Valenti, for a time, may have been a part of John LaRocca's family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, without getting too deep into it, Rochester had long been semi-controlled or under the dominion of the Magadino crime family in Buffalo, but was never 100% under Magadino control. They were sort of their own family, if you will. It was reported in Joe Valachi's 1963 testimony that Frank Valenti had become at some point a member of the Bonanno crime family in New York City. This note from 1966 would tend to indicate that maybe that was in doubt. In any event, the note suggested talk of a transfer from what appears to be the Magadino crime family to the Bonanno crime family. Now, of course, FBI reports can be wrong, but you have to be a member of one family in order to transfer to another, correct? And maybe the report itself was just him talking about which family he was going to be with, but it's clear the report was from 66-67. Valachi's testimony was 63, and the Valenti attended the Appalachian meeting in 57, so he had to have been made somewhere. And a lot of people believe that he was made in Pittsburgh. Maybe the transfer in discussion was going to be from Pittsburgh to Buffalo or from Pittsburgh to the Bonannos, and he was trying to decide which guy he was going to go with. We'll do a deep dive episode on Frank Valenti at some point. Regarding other known transfers of members to other families, here are a few cases where guys either moved between families or tried to move between families. Probably the most well-known, Johnny Roselli. I think most are aware that at some point Johnny Roselli was a member of the Chicago outfit, serving as an emissary to the Los Angeles LCN family in Hollywood and also operating in Vegas and elsewhere. Truly a Renaissance man. The note I'm showing on screen indicates that the transfer of Roselli from Chicago to LA had been approved in the 1950s by LA boss Frank DeSimone, but DeSimone had not informed the new boss, Nick Licata, prior to his death. And subsequently, I do not believe that the transfer of Roselli from Chicago to LA ever formally went through. The next up, Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano. It's well known that Fradiano came up in the Cleveland underworld, but moved out to California in the 1940s, where he was made into the Los Angeles family. However, a 1968 report would indicate that there was a situation in which there was a proposed transfer of Fradiano to Chicago, which was vetoed by the boss at the time, Nick Licata. Supposedly years before, Johnny Roselli had arranged for Fradiano to be transferred to Chicago, as well as he'd convinced members of the outfit, this being Fradiano, that he could make them big money with his businesses on the West Coast. It's alleged that Sam Giancana essentially told DeSimone that the transfer of Fradiano was happening. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But similar to Roselli, this was another situation where the transfer was approved by DeSimone, but not communicated to Licata when he took over. This miscommunication allegedly left Fradiano's family affiliation in a somewhat confused state at the time. In an interesting twist, it's alleged by the informant in the report that the decision went all the way to the commission in New York, and Tommy Lucchese himself killed the transfer. Fradiano himself would allege that when he became co-boss of the LA family in the mid-1970s, he was tricked into becoming co-boss along with Louis Tom Dragna, nephew of former boss Jack Dragna. This move into a leadership position apparently required him to be transferred from the Chicago outfit back to the Los Angeles family. Now, as confusing as this may sound, this would mean that at some point his transfer to Chicago had been approved and that he was a member of the Chicago outfit. Ultimately, this and several other things set the stage for Fradiano to flip and start informing on the Mafia. Next up, Nicky Bianco. Nicky Bianco was an original member of the Gallo group during what became known as the First Colombo War, in which Joey Gallo, Larry Gallo, and their crew rebelled against old-time family boss Joseph Profaci in the early 1960s. During the war, Bianco was just an associate of the Colombo family, then the Profaci family. However, due to the fact that Bianco had been born and raised in Providence, Rhode Island, he had connections in that area as well. At the zenith of the war, as Profaci had died and Magliocco had taken over, Bianco was able to leverage his relationships in Providence to get commission member and boss of the Providence Borgata, Raymond L.S. Patriarca, to serve as mediator. Patriarca was able to strike a deal in which Magliocco would step down and new boss Joseph Colombo was accepted by the Gallo Group. The Gallos would be brought back into the family, and Nicky Bianco would be made into the Providence family, where he'd serve as the liaison to the Colombos for many years. Bianco would eventually rise to boss of the Patriarchas for a short time in the early 1990s before passing away in 1994. Next up, James Jack White Licavoli. James Jack White Licavoli was born and raised in the tough streets of St. Louis, Missouri, making his mark in the criminal underworld in the 1920s. However, after surviving a one-way ride where his friends were murdered, he fled to Detroit, where he had cousins who were involved with Detroit's Zerilli Tocco family. According to reports, Licavoli was made into the Detroit family, but was later transferred to the Cleveland family under John Scalish. After the death of Scalish in 1976, Licavoli became boss of the Cleveland Borgata before he was ultimately brought down by informants after the Danny Green homicide. Here's a few more. Salvatore and Angelo Marino. Both Salvatore, the father, and Angelo Marino, the son, were affiliated with the La Rocca crime family out of Pittsburgh. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Salvatore moved from Sharon, Pennsylvania, out to San Jose, California, and started the California Cheese Company. It would appear that Salvatore, being a made member at that time, transferred his membership from Pittsburgh to San Jose with the approval of La Rocca. At some point in the mid-1950s, Angelo Marino, the son, appears to have been made either by La Rocca or in San Jose by boss Onofrio Shortino. However, by the early 1960s, it was clear that Angelo was a captain within the San Jose family, which by that point had become the Cerrito crime family, with Joe Cerrito becoming boss around the same time. So it's unclear whether Angelo's situation was a transfer, but his father Salvatore was most definitely transferred. Moving on, same family, Dominic Anzalone. In another Pittsburgh to San Jose transfer, Pittsburgh soldier Dominic Anzalone also transferred from the Pittsburgh Borgata to the San Jose Borgata in the mid-1960s. Anzalone was placed actually on the payroll of the Marino's California Cheese Company, but a rift quickly developed between himself, the Marinos, and John La Rocca, which ended in Salvatore Marino, who was a capo in the San Jose family, being demoted from capo to soldier, his son, Angelo Marino, being upped to take over his father's position as a capo, and Dominic Anzalone being viewed very negatively by all parties. And if the San Jose family had actually had more teeth, Anzalone probably would have been killed. If he had been in any other family, he probably would have been clipped. Moving on, Charles Batts Battaglia, LA to Bonanno family. Charlie Batts was a longtime soldier in the Los Angeles and Bonanno crime families. Now, according to an August 1968 report, Charles Battaglia had been a member of the Los Angeles family, but due to the fact that he did not get along with boss Frank DeSimone, he transferred to the Bonanno family. However, 18 months prior to this report, Battaglia was having second thoughts and approached Louis Tom Dragna, as I previously stated, the nephew of former boss Jack Dragna, and asked to be transferred back to the Los Angeles Borgata. Unfortunately, the Bonanno family was still expelled from the commission at that time due to the issue with Joe Bonanno, so the transfer back to the LA family never actually went through. Battaglia would stay close with Bonanno in Tucson, Arizona, and would pass away in 1983. Last but not least, certainly not least, the Rebel Gallo crew. Okay, I think I've nearly beaten this horse to death, but the last example of transfers that I'll quickly cover would be the breakup of the Gallo crew in the 1970s after Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo was killed in 1972. After this event, and once some of the dust had settled, Gallo crew members Albert Kid Blast Gallo and Frank Punchy Iliano would transfer to the Genovese family, Bobby Borriello to the Gambinos, and the aforementioned Nicky Bianco to the Patriarcas, just to name a few. All of this is to demonstrate that transfers did occur between families from time to time if approval was granted by the boss. However, if approval was not granted, the member would have to stay within their original family for better or worse. Not only that, while I just rattled off 8 or 9 different instances of transfers, I wouldn't say that transfers were the norm. It's not like college football's transfer portal. By and large, transfers of members didn't happen very often, and I'd hazard a guess that 99% of members stayed with their original family once they were made and initiated into Cosa Nostra. I would also add that some of these guys were transferred around when they were just associates. Therefore, they went from being under the umbrella of one family to under the umbrella of another, but in a less formal associate capacity. They had not been initiated, so it was probably a little easier to trade the pieces, so to speak. And that is where I think we're going to end today's episode. As always, if you like this episode, please do me a favor and share it with as many people as you can to help me keep the channel growing. If you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to hop on board and subscribe via YouTube, or consider signing up as a capo on my Patreon channel. Would really appreciate it. Any support goes to the content and the rigor that I use that goes ultimately back into the show. All money that I get, it's really going back into the show. In any event, please leave your comments below to tell me what you liked and disliked. And if you want to reach out to me personally, you can always send me an email at ganglandhistorypodcast@gmail.com. As I said at the top of the episode, we'll be doing a part 3 and part 4, most likely to finish this series out. There's still a lot of really, really good stuff in this report that I've yet to cover. Really haven't even scratched the surface, including full leadership charts for every single family across the country at that time. I appreciate all of you and look forward to continuing to produce new content. I've got some great biographies planned for the very near future, which I'm super excited about, as well as many more great interviews coming your way. There's a lot of good content coming very soon. In any event, thank you for your continued support, and as I end every episode, grazie.
Thank you for listening to the Gangland History Podcast. If you'd like to donate to the show, check out our Patreon channel. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe to help the channel grow. If you're an audio-only listener, subscribe via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Until next time, don't forget to keep your mouth shut.